Thank you, everyone, for joining the Internet of Water Coalition today. I'm Faith Sternlieb. I'm an Associate Director of Engagement at the Center for Geospatial Solutions, where I work on the Internet of Water initiative. Today, we are convening a panel on a global conversation on water data for reuse innovation, lessons from the LA River, Global South. But before we get started, I'd like to cover a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar today, so the recording and slides will be available on the IOW YouTube channel about a week after the webinar. So if you'd like to refer to anything you heard in today's webinar, if you'd like to share this webinar with friends or colleagues, you'll be able to do that. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please drop it in the Q&A, and we will go through the questions after the presentation. If you have any technical issues, please put those in chat, and we will try to get those fixed as soon as possible. So now on to the main event. I am very pleased to welcome our panel. We have two presenters, and we have two panelists. One of our presenters, Clive Lipchin, he's the director of the Center for Transboundary Water Management at the Arava Institute, and Bruce Resnick, he's the executive director of the LA Waterkeeper. And then for our panelists, we have Kim Nelson, who's chief operating officer of True Elements, and Christiane Morsink, former president of the Global Water Alliance. So I am going to ask Christiane, if you could please turn on your camera and join us for some introductory remarks about the webinar. Thank you so much.
Hi, Kate, Faith. Good seeing you, and I'm looking forward to an interesting webinar. We started in this actually last year at the United Nations Water Summit in New York in March, and we built an argument together about how we need to work on with the modern data and the possibilities of new technologies that have become available. And the discussion in those days was very much last year on the topic of how to organize the data, how to democratize the data, and how to make sure that we have as much as possible complete data. And then who owns the data, etc. We had discussion parts as well. The discussions at that time were of such a nature that we decided that we would like to keep going and organize some more opportunities for collaborations and presentations. This particular webinar is a follow-up on that. And I think that we hope that this particular webinar can be followed with other ones as well. But I would like to keep it at this level. And Faith, please carry it from here.
Thank you so much, Christiane. So I want to welcome Clive to turn on your camera so that you can present. You have an extremely interesting case that we're going to be looking into, and really looking forward to learning more about what you have to share from the Middle East.
Thanks, Faith, and thanks to everyone for making the time to be with us today. So I'm going to go ahead, share my slides. Okay, so I'm assuming everybody can.
Looks good, Clive. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I'm talking specifically on addressing the issue of providing food, energy, and water to communities and others that are not being adequately serviced by infrastructure. Specifically looking at the challenge of what we would term off-the-grid communities. So what I work on specifically in this context of off-the-grid from the food, energy, water nexus is looking at the WASH situation, specifically that of wastewater. And as you can see in this simplified graphic, 2/3 of the world's population, 70%, of the world's population is not treating at all its wastewater. And of course, where is this wastewater going if it's not being treated? It's either directly or indirectly finding its way as a source of pollution and a public health risk into the environment. If you think about wastewater as a source of water that can actually be made productive versus a source of pollution, then we begin to think about opportunities to improve not just the wash situation, but also to connect improved wastewater treatment to beneficial purposes, specifically that of providing a good source of water for irrigation. So this quote from the UN from 2017 pretty much puts that into perspective in terms of understanding the problem, but finding an innovative way to turn that problem into an effective solution. So here we see why this is so important. We're looking at roughly 3.2 billion people that lack access to adequate sanitation. And the challenges, which is what I will be addressing and also what we will be discussing as a panel here today on our webinar, some of these challenges are technological, they're financial, and they are also a problem from the perspective of governance or policy. And in the bottom there, the issues can be briefly summarized as a lack of essential infrastructure, access to technology to treat wastewater, has a human health risk, a socioeconomic challenge, and of course, it is going to adversely impact the environment. And we are trying to find the best possible approaches to changing this. So when we think about how to approach this problem with respect to communities that lack access to, in this case, with respect to the wash issue, sewer grids, centralized wastewater treatment facilities, and so forth, there are many, many opportunities to provide these services that do not require very sophisticated, very expensive centralized infrastructure, whether it be in terms of energy, wastewater, drinking water, solid waste management, or food production. You can see here some examples of so-called off-the-grid solutions that can be brought to address these challenges. One example is the work that I do in wastewater, which is we've developed an off-the-grid, standalone, plug-and-play wastewater treatment facility that can simply take sewage from where it's discharged. This could be into a septic tank, or oftentimes in the developing world, it's an unlined cesspit. And this technology can take that wastewater directly from that point, treat it using a nature-based solution. In this case, it's a biofilm made up primarily of algae. Treat the wastewater on site at the point of discharge, but not only treat the wastewater, provide this treated wastewater as a highly valuable, nutrient-rich source of water for irrigation. And that's really important, linking the treatment with reuse, because in many cases, the communities that we are looking at working with throughout the developing world, many of these communities not only face the infrastructure challenge, but they're also very much dependent on agriculture, whether it be for subsistence-based agriculture or income-based agriculture. And one of the biggest challenges these communities face is lack of access to water for irrigation. So addressing that issue through better wastewater management is essential. The challenge from a data perspective, and this of course is our topic of discussion today, is when we are going to treat wastewater on site in an off-grid situation, we need to make sure that the water is of a quality that is not going to be a risk to the environment and to people. Now, governments all around the world have wastewater treatment standards. Here I'm showing you the Israeli and Palestinian standards that were developed nearly 20 years ago. And these standards are what are being used by government regulators for using wastewater in irrigation or for discharging that wastewater into the environment. So you can see here a list of parameters. You can see what the standards are, meaning this is what one needs to do in order to be in compliance with respect to regulators to reuse this wastewater. The challenge when one goes off-grid is how do we actually gather this information so that both users of that wastewater, in this case farmers, know that the quality is suitable for the crops they're growing. Consumers can be confident that they are consuming food that is not going to be a risk to them. And regulators know that all of this is operating within a compliance structure vis-a-vis these regulatory standards. We are able to address this, for example, in the technology that I showed you briefly, which we developed and are beginning to implement in projects around the world. So here's an example of a data grab, if you will, showing that treatment on from our off-grid treatment facility is producing very good effluent results. You can see that in terms of the percentage improvement. But what's the problem? The problem is that this data is data that is being analyzed in a laboratory, which is very expensive to do. We have to find ways in which we can collect this data, analyze this data, present this data, disseminate this data at a community level where, for example, access to laboratories are not possible, or the cost of analyzing the data in labs is prohibitive. So, of course, one can do field sampling, and here's a picture showing you how field sampling can be done. There's many field kits that can be used, not very expensive, to measure water quality on site. But the problem with field sampling is there is a lack of accuracy. Access to these systems sometimes is a financial barrier. And of course, one has to provide effective and meaningful capacity building in terms of training communities to collect this information. It's important to understand when one looks at addressing this problem off the grid, you are dealing with people who are not trained to be engineers. For example, they would have all the requisite skills in managing sophisticated infrastructure or have the skills to collect and measure and analyze data. So capacity building at a localized level in terms of how do we not only find the right people at the community level, but also connect those people to the right kinds of technologies to effectively gather this data and make this data both available and useful. So field sampling is possible, but it still has many, many challenges. It's difficult to do. The field kits are not accurate. Governments often will not accept the results coming from these field samplings. And it also takes a lot of time and resources to do this effectively. A more interesting way in which this kind of off-the-grid sampling can be done is to see where new technologies are innovating in water quality sensors that can be put into specific sites and can remotely monitor the data and send that data to a cloud-based server. So here's a snapshot or a photograph, if you will, of one example of a technology that we are using in some of our work. So this is very encouraging because these kinds of field sensors are giving us data that don't require directly involving or having to train people to do the data gathering and analysis. The downside and the challenge we find is that these technologies are still very, very expensive. And so effectively disseminating these technologies in off-the-grid situations where the communities that we are dealing with are in many places low income, we have here a financial challenge in bringing these technologies to be the most effective they can. In other words, one area that we need to be looking at is how do we develop these technologies to be much more affordable to the communities that need access to these technologies the most. And my last slide is to summarize all of this from a circular economy perspective. And the phrase that we're beginning to use is from waste to wealth. And as it says there in that sentence, by unlocking the productive value of treated wastewater, we can help communities transition toward a circular economy while mitigating risk factors associated with sewage pollution. So water is not just water, it is security and growth. And to end my talk, just to summarize the main points that we will engage on in this webinar, when one looks at dealing with this situation of both treating wastewater and reusing it for irrigation and other non-potable uses for communities that lack access to centralized infrastructure, the challenges can be summarized as the following. We need to address the governance challenges. How do we get governments to effectively regulate and be ensured that the treatment of wastewater at a localized level is within compliance of government standards? Challenge number one. Challenge number two is we have to address the financial challenges. Technology does exist, but it's very, very expensive. So we need to understand where is the money coming from, and not to just think about, oh, this is money that has to come from donors. We have to develop appropriate community-based business models where the communities will be able to generate income to effectively operate and maintain these types of off-the-grid water quality sensors. So the financial challenge is challenge number three. And the third challenge is, of course, the effective overall capacity building and education and engagement of the communities to have both the ability and means to treat wastewater on site and to have the ability and means to use that water as an effective means in irrigation to improve both food security and climate change resilience, specifically in areas where water scarcity of agriculture is a challenge. So at that point, I will end my talk. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Clive. And you really laid the path, set this up very well for our next guest, Bruce Resnick from LA Waterkeepers. So traveling across the world to Western US to hear about, what's going on in the LA River and how these challenges that you're facing, similar challenges and solutions. Thank you, Bruce.
Excellent. Well, good morning, everyone, from a very, very wet LA today, but hanging in there, doing okay. Hopefully my dogs behave because I can't put them out. And I'm here to present a really different example, a very on-the-grid example from Los Angeles. And I am the LA Waterkeeper, one of more than 300 locally based waterkeepers around the globe, fighting for healthy waterways, resilient water systems, stronger communities. And here to talk about our large-scale wastewater recycling projects that are underway in LA. Next slide, please. So first, I always like to have a lot of quotes in my slides and a lot of images. It's really important to get the scale of LA because it's really hard to understand if you're not here in the challenges, which is, it's not just the 10 million people, which means 1 in 35 Americans lives in LA County, or if we were a state, we would be the 10th most populous state. It's that it's spread across over 88 cities, 200 water agencies. We have a $700 billion gross domestic product, which makes it the third largest metropolitan, and anywhere from massive ports to tourism to industry, oil and gas, Hollywood music. I mean, you name it, we have it in LA. And of course, we could never have grown that, next slide, without water. And if folks who don't know this quote, if you're not as familiar, if you haven't, maybe watched Chinatown, LA has had to take our water from other places. And it started back in 1908 with William Mulholland, who went to Owens Valley, about 200 miles northeast of LA, and saw water up there and said, there it is, take it. It's sort of the unofficial motto of LA. And that was the beginning of our dependence on imported water. 20 years later, we had the Metropolitan Water District formed by 13 local water agencies and cities to get water from the Colorado. And about 3 decades after that, and this is the picture on the right, Pat Brown, Governor Brown, Jerry Brown's father, if folks don't know it, created the State Water Project, which brought water from the Bay Delta. And next slide. So if you look at what that means today, and this is a slide from the Metropolitan Water District, so this is the percentage from throughout Southern California, but LA is pretty similar. I'd also note local supplies, they include the LA aqueduct as a local supply. That is not accurate. That's 200 miles away from us. So if you look at LA's numbers, LA County, the 10 million people of LA County, import about 2/3, 60% to 2/3 of our water. City of LA is closer to 90%. So hugely dependent. There those dogs go. Hugely dependent on, again, you see the Colorado, the LA aqueduct, the Bay Delta, the State Water Project, Bay Delta. Next slide. And of course, these sources are drying up, not partly because of our heavily energy intensive water sector. The water sector is actually the largest user of electricity in the state of California, about 20%. We have drying up snowpacks, as you see in the upper left, Mono Lake, which is the Owens Valley, the LA Aqueduct drying up, collapsing, Colorado River, Lake Mead, Lake Powell collapsing, Bay Delta collapsing. So LA's water policy doesn't only impact the 10 million people in LA or the 19 million people in Southern California. It really impacts 60 million people across 7 Western states. Next slide. So we need a new way of thinking about water, a new paradigm. Next slide. And we call it, and I stole this, the new Mulholland moment from Mayor Garcetti. We need to think about using our water locally. And for LA Waterkeeper, that's reduce, reuse, recycle, restore, conservation and efficiency, multi-benefit stormwater capture, restoring our groundwater that's contaminated from decades of waste and aerospace. But here today, we're talking about recycled wastewater. Next slide. And so just by the numbers, and this sort of shows the insanity of LA. I had it earlier in one of the slides. Like if you talk about LA out loud, it makes no sense. We use about 1.2 billion gallons of water a day in LA County. It's changes, and we've done fairly well with conservation, used to be higher. We import 60% to 2/3 of that countywide, so 750 million gallons a day. Huge energy embed, huge cost to bring it down, huge impacts in those communities from where we take it. And yet, we treat this water, we use it once, we then treat it again, and we dump it out in the ocean. And about 400 to 500 million gallons a day goes into the ocean, which, as you see, is the majority of our imported water. And so we are planning some large-scale wastewater recycling projects. Could be 330 or more million gallons a day of wastewater recycling, which is about a quarter of, maybe up to a third of our current water usage in the region, and about 50% of our imported water. And you think of the benefits that could bring to all those places we import. Next slide. So this was just sort of the start of Mayor Garcetti laying out, former Mayor Garcetti, now Ambassador, our goal of recycling all of the city's wastewater to drinking water. But there's obviously a lot of challenges with that. Next slide. So this is the city's plan. And I say that because we don't fully know the plan, because frankly, LA Sanitation, which manages wastewater, and LA DWP, which manages drinking water, are still trying to figure out the plan and work together. But that red dot is Hyperion. That's our largest wastewater facility, 230 million gallons a day. This is where they're looking to treat it and then send the majority of it back up to the San Fernando Valley, but some of it could go elsewhere, tie into other systems. Again, is this the right way to do it? I mean, we know we want to recycle wastewater, but getting it all down to one centralized infrastructure, Hyperion, and then pumping it back up mountains to San Fernando Valley, maybe that's the right thing. I think that's what we still need to figure out. Next slide. The other big project, and actually the bigger wastewater treatment facility, even bigger than Hyperion's 230 million, is that Orange Square, controlled by the county sanitation district, which is not only the county, but about 78 cities in the region that discharge. That manages about 280 million gallons a day. Similar game plan. They want to recycle about 150 million gallons a day. The LA plan actually is looking at recycling 180 or more of additional wastewater recycling. This is about 150, but same thing, get all the water down, pump it back up to the spreading grounds into different groundwater basins. But again, I think those are some of the things that we need to think through. So next slide. So what are some of the challenges? And by the way, that picture on the left is a map that UCLA did of all the interconnected 200 water agencies in LA. So you see some of the governance challenges that Clive brought up earlier. So the first question is, how much do we want to centralize versus decentralize? There's advantages with either and both, but these are some of the things we need to think through. Upstream and downstream needs. If we're recycling more upstream, which is closer to source, most of our rivers, particularly the LA River, most of the flow is actually from treated wastewater. So we would be drying up the LA River. Does that make sense? How much do we want to use our existing infrastructure? Again, there's benefits, but it can be very, gray and centralized versus new. How do we make sure all the communities, as we transition from imported water to local water, have access? How do we balance indirect potable, so sending it to groundwater, versus direct potable back right into the water systems? We just adopted direct potable reuse regulations in California, or non-potable. How do we address the water quality concerns of more concentrated brine? How much should we integrate our systems? How do we minimize the financial impact? And this is, again, a point Clive raised. $20 billion is the estimate to do all this. Now, that's going to lead to cleaner oceans, more water security, but how do we minimize that? How do we manage the ecosystems, as my friend Felicia Marcus always says, and all the agency squabbles? We have very complicated water rights and governance in California, including we adjudicate our groundwater basin. So just because you put water in doesn't mean it's easy to get out, which could be influencing some of the decisions. And how do we ensure the public is engaged? So our next steps, and I know we'll talk about this more in a second, is we're actually convening a technical advisory committee independent on February 22nd to answer all these questions. We're, of course, doing our inside game, advocating at the political arena, environmental review, pushing to get as much state and local and federal funding to reduce impacts on our ratepayers, and, of course, engage in community engagement. And the last slide I have, oh, sorry, I didn't say next. So next slide, what we're doing. Next slide after that, my closing slide. I always like to, I say I like quotes, and I love The Clash and Joe Strummer. The future is unwritten. William Mulholland and Pat Brown, they wrote one future for LA. We can do what we want to write another future. And I always like this image. This is the Venice Beach in the 19-teens or so, and the oil extraction, not what Venice Beach looks like today. If we can imagine it, we can do it. And we just need to make sure that we're doing it right. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce. Wow. Completely different cases, completely different geographies, population, data, but similar challenges. So really appreciate both your presentation, Bruce, and Clive's. I want to welcome him now, and Christian and Clive also. And what we're going to do is we are going to ask Kim Nelson, as Chief Operating Officer for True Elements, a data expert, and Christian Morsink, who I introduced earlier, former president of the Global Water Alliance, and past executive director of the United Nations Association of Greater Philadelphia. We're going to ask both Kim and Christian to offer their comments, what they have heard, how they think, how this is shaping the landscape, and where we're going to go from here. So, Kim, love to ask you to present your comments, and Christian, I'll ask you after Kim is done. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Faith. And you took the words out of my mouth. Clive and Bruce sitting on opposite sides of the world, right, in very different environments, and yet dealing with transformative projects that have some similarities. And I'm struck by both Clive and Bruce talked about the astonishing amount of water that is discharged into the ocean every day. And, we don't get to reuse. So that's what we're here all about. That's what we're here to talk about today is, right, how do we really get creative about more circularity in water use? There were three things I really picked up as I listened to both of them. One is, like everything in water, water reuse is complex, right? And this reuse presents some very new challenges in a really old industry. So while there's a need for water reuse and there's a great interest in it, it is really complicated by the fact that there are often so many agencies and organizations involved. And Bruce just touched on that, and Clive touched on that a little bit. You know, here in the US, it's really rare to find a single agency responsible for both water supply and wastewater treatment. We've got over 50,000 public water supplies in the US. Bruce, I didn't realize there were 200 in LA County alone. So that agency fragmentation is just one of the many hurdles that everybody's facing here. And the other jurisdictional issue is among the different levels of government, right? You've got federal, state, local, tribes, and even Clive shared the two different national standards he had to deal with the issues they were facing. So we've got a lot of these issues we're facing. I think one of the real highlights, though, is, you know, in addition to all the public sector organizations we're dealing with for the most part, private sector needs to be involved too. And technology and innovation are going to play a huge part in addressing this issue. And it was great to hear Clive say there is a lot of technology out there. Unfortunately, it's still expensive. So how do we address that? The second issue I picked up on is, you know, we know billions of dollars will be spent in this area in the next decade or so. Here in the US, we've had a lot of legislation passed for infrastructure. And so we know a lot of money will be spent here and elsewhere. The thing that always concerns me is, how do we make sure that money gets spent in a way that's different than it was spent in the past, right? We need to make sure that the decisions are made with better insights so that the money goes where it can do the most good and in a way that is really and truly equitable. So the good news is there's a lot of reuse work underway here in the US. States, there are regulations in Florida, Arizona, Colorado. Leaders in Illinois are looking at many ways they can address this issue because there are water supply issues in the populous parts of those states. So that's a key opportunity, though, to make sure we allocate those funds differently in a way that is equitable. And then the bottom line, Christian started off talking about, we started this conversation a year ago around data and how do we make data more transparent? How do we make data and democratize the access to data? And that's what I want to say, because both Clive talked about that and Bruce a little bit. And that if we're going to get these projects moving and we're going to get public support for these projects, we really need a lot more data, and we need to bring the public into that data to get the buy-in. And at True Elements, we talk about not data, we talk about water intelligence. And for us, water intelligence is this unique combination of state-of-the-art technology, scientific analysis, generative AI capabilities that quickly and easily transform the complex world of data into clear, actionable insights, and enable very specific solutions to local water challenges. So to get the public buy-in that Bruce needs on a huge project that he's dealing with, to get the buy-in that Clive talked about, government regulators and others being able to invest, they need good data, and the data needs to be easily understood, and it needs to be accessible to a lot of people. So I would like to just finish off by saying, you know, as we have this conversation today, it's really important that this water intelligence and these insights are available to everybody across the board in order to ensure that these projects move at the pace we want them to move, because we can't afford to continue to have all that water being discharged in the ocean and not used effectively.
Thank you, Kim. You summed that up really well in terms of you know, the similarities and challenges, and even a little bit on touching on what's next. Really appreciate that perspective. We heard, you know, from the local level in the U.S., a local level in the Middle East. We heard from the, you know, Kim, from you thinking about what's happening in the U.S. nationally. And so, Christian, if you could offer your comments and kind of tie this all together. What are we looking at globally here?
Well, indeed, and I have to say, the thing like LA and other places, we have a long history of building large infrastructures for getting water to people, and the wastewater handling has been kind of a sideshow after that. In the old cities like Paris and we have never built any idea of reusing wastewater other than getting it into the ocean and into the rivers and getting it away through the sewer system. So we have a very long history of handling sewage by getting rid of it. And the idea of reusing it is only in the old days related to what can be done in agriculture. And the old ideas of using that and distributing it over the fields has been done in Ireland and other places. And when you don't look at it in the current text of what's going on global warming, and you see the degradations of the environment and the ecologies, then you start realizing that wastewater treatment is not only, and wastewater reuse is actually an important element in the whole restoring of the ecologies that we have been neglecting. Instead of using the nature, this can become an opportunity of working with nature. And the notion of bringing it to the agricultural part is one part of the story, but you can also use it in the context of reforestation. And then looking at the Sahel, the ideas of doing this places where water indeed comes in for a small period of time, and then you know what it happens to go away and to store it. So water conservation and reuse of water, wastewater goes almost hand in hand in the context of doing something in the places like the Sahel. So I think that these particular technologies are extremely relevant. The interesting element that I would like to add to the intelligence is that intelligence can only be read by people who know what they're reading. So the water literacy aspect, I think, is pretty relevant here as well. Everybody knows how to cut a tree down, but very few people know how to grow trees other than seeing nature doing it. So there's a whole element of learning and educating and working with water where I think that we need to pay attention to the education component that is involved in this. Money is definitely an important element, but it goes almost to the level of public health, public education, and that is another agency to speak, where the ministries of education needs to become involved in how to do these things. So I think that this particular model of using a really large, incredibly large thing that has been now looked at in all kinds of cities, in Lagos and elsewhere, and you have to compare that to what Clive is offering in this show about how you can actually use it in the neglected parts of the world where 60% of the wastewater is still not being reused or recycled. Those are the kind of places where I think we can use the current knowledge and the current technology of e-measurings and data collections in a way that has never been able to do before. That whole, we are actually all on the grid, great by Google and stuff like that. So we actually have a grid. It's the data grid, and let's work with that and use it.
Excellent. Thank you, Christian. Looks like we have at least one question from the audience, and I really encourage others to ask your questions anonymously or not. Either way, we would love to continue this conversation. So I believe this is mostly for Clive, although I'm sure that others could comment as well in your areas of expertise. Thinking about Israel's boron requirements for irrigation, most sewage treatment systems do not remove this element and other similar contaminants. Are these better addressed in the water treatment process so that the water can be reused?
Sorry, what's the question about boron?
Okay, so you did not hear. I think so the questions in the Q&A also, so you can read it as well, Clive. But it is thinking about boron. The question's about removing boron. What is the best way to remove boron and other similar contaminants from the water treatment process so water can be reused?
Well, I hate to say to the person that posed the question, but I don't know what the answer is because I'm not an engineer. So I really can't say. All I can say is that we have a problem with boron in addition to, the reason that we find boron in our wastewater is because of the fact that most of our potable water in Israel, that is, because most of our potable water comes from seawater desalination, and so boron is part of that process. But if the person posing the question wants a specific technical question, unfortunately, as a non-engineer, I'm sorry, I can't answer the question.
And just as a follow-up, with the system that you developed, does your system remove contaminants like that?
So our system, again, well, let me try to say it like this, okay? When we're looking at recycling wastewater for irrigation, the most important parameters that we need to think about, which is also coming from the regulator, is the BOD, the COD, and the TSS. So that's what we are always measuring. So if you think about what the broader piece here about water intelligence for me in the wastewater space for reuse is the BOD, COD, and TSS. And so that we measure.
Can you spell those out, Clive? BOD?
Sorry.
Can you?
They're just proxies for contamination. So we have biological oxygen demand, chemical oxygen demand, and total suspended solids. So those are the three most important parameters that all wastewater treatment plants have to deal with to say, is the water of a acceptable water quality? To link it specifically to what we're talking about here is, at the moment, to measure those three parameters, you can only really measure them at a laboratory. So when we talk about these, water quality sensors, these innovative technologies that are looking to measure water in situ, if you will, they still are not being able to provide that level of information. So this is a big problem for us. If we can't measure those parameters in easily accessible and affordable ways at the community level, then what are the alternatives, or how do we develop a proxy measures to get that information? And this is also a problem from the governance side, because that's what the regulator wants. They want those three numbers, those three parameters. And if we can't get those parameters at the localized level, we have a big problem. I know there are people looking into how to solve this at a technological sensor level, but at the moment, what I know is we have to take those samples, in the field, send those samples to a lab, and often, again, in the developing world, there just isn't a lab to get that information.
Thank you, Clive. Thanks for expanding on that. We have two other questions. We have another question for you, Clive, but I'm going to pose this question to Bruce so we can mix it up a bit, and then we'll ask you the question for you. So for both proposed large infrastructure systems in LA, and actually this is also for you, Clive, the off-grid solutions in Mid-East, how many times can the water be reused? Once, twice, 10 times? What would you say, Bruce?
I mean, the short answer is all water is reused all the time. There is no new water. We're drinking the Roman water. So yeah, I don't see any limit for recycling the water. It just goes back into the system and kind of keeps running through. If I can also just give a really quick answer to the last question. And I also am a policy wonk and environmental attorney, not a technical person. And boron is something I haven't thought about, so I will certainly bring that up when we have our technical advisory group. We do get a lot of questions here about emerging contaminants, PFAS, pharmaceuticals in the wastewater getting in drink water, and the advanced purification does do a really good job with that. It raises other questions about what you do with the waste, what you do with the PFAS once you've collected it out. And obviously there's a huge education component, recognizing that, but certainly what we're planning to do with the wastewater recycling is much better than what we do currently from the Colorado River and all that, which has huge amount of wastewater discharge, Bay Delta, huge amount of agricultural discharge. So it's better than what we're currently getting, but we do have to think about these sort of emerging contaminants. So I appreciate the question, and it'll be a question I ask to some experts in 2 weeks.
Thanks for doubling back on that, Bruce. I appreciate that expansion on the question. And then, Clive, for you, I guess, how do those off-grid systems work with continuous reuse?
So it's very similar to what Bruce just said, right? I mean, water is continuously recycled. So as I also sort of brought to a close in my talk, we're looking to develop all of this as a circular economy approach. So water can be recycled basically, infinitely, right? But it's not about how often you recycle it, right? You can keep recycling water forever. It's what is the quality? So it comes back to the data. It comes back to the intelligence. And Bruce is right. I mean, today there's great concern about all these contaminants of emerging concern in our drinking water. So the PFAS issue is now becoming a huge issue globally. We are seeing that also coming up into the wastewater. I have some colleagues here in Israel that have shown that there are PFAS concentrates in irrigation water. The issue of pharmaceuticals, of course, is a massive one. And at the moment, we can identify those contaminants, this technology to identify them and even to quantify them. But I'll bring it back to governance. At the moment, I'm unaware, maybe Bruce can jump in here, but I'm unaware of any regulations that have actually said these are the allowable limits for something like PFAS or pharmaceuticals in our wastewater and or in our drinking water. So these are growing concerns as we simply will have to, because there's no choice, recycle more and more water for both potable and non-potable use.
Excellent. Kim and Christian, any comments to add, or should we go to the next question?
No, in some of the situations of used water can once used cannot be taken out. And the whole problem of hormones in water, and it goes for and then agricultural wastewater and the husbandry, where we do a lot of that hormonal feeding to cows and stuff. That is the kind of problem that we have to, at a certain moment, learn to live with. We have, in principle, a wicked problem, in the sense that you cannot completely solve it, and there will be new problems coming up. And the idea is that what comes out of this particular approach of wastewater recycling and reuse is that in the future there will be adaptation to be done. And at the moment we don't have to call all the questions yet. But overall, in a systems perspective, I think it's high time that we do indeed recycle and reuse our wastewater. And
Yep.
so that we have to learn as we go along.
Yeah, I just, this is a crawl, walk, run situation. Just in terms of PFAS, at least here in the US, for drinking water, there are new PFAS drinking water contaminant levels. So starting in the next year, those will be reported along with the 80 other contaminants that drinking water supplies have to report. But in terms of other reuse, that is not the case.
No.
Great, thank you both. So this next question for Clive, what kind of professionals or degrees are most needed in the international water treatment arena?
I was just typing the answer.
Yep.
So I'll say, look,
Thanks.
in my experience, when you're working off grid and you're working with local communities, a challenge is capacity, right? I mean, you're looking at providing a technological solution to communities where you don't have qualified engineers, for example, that will be able to do the operation and maintenance. You don't have somebody with let's say a chemistry background that understands water quality, right? So either we have to bring people in from the outside with that expertise, or we have to find appropriate means of training the community to do this. And that's the latter is really what's important. And it's not like somebody has to go to university and get an engineering degree. Often this is not something that local communities have, unfortunately, the opportunity to do. So we must always, and this is our approach, we are not parachuting solutions into the communities. It's all about looking at those communities not as beneficiaries, but as partners. And so it's how you engage and build a partnership, and where you can transfer a sufficient number of skills to individuals in the community that would be the ones that would receive the responsibility for operation and maintenance or water quality assessments and so on and so forth. And that is very much context specific. What will work in one community in one part of the world is not going to be the same in another community, another part of the world. So there isn't a straightforward answer. It's challenging. I just came back from Nepal, and the culture, the context, everything there is different from my work in Israel. So you really have to think about providing these skills in a context-specific way. Maybe, I don't know if that's a very cogent answer, but that's the reality on the ground for these kinds of things.
Yeah. And also make sure that you stick with the skills that are needed in that environment. Having to learn things that you cannot apply makes no sense. So the training has to indeed fit within the circumstances as well. And that element is often lost when you start doing the education. You learn about things that you actually don't need in real life. So the community component and how to do that is very relevant. Very relevant.
Can I jump in with a quick thought too? And I know the LA is a very different kind of example, and the obvious answer would be, civil engineers or people who understand wastewater. I also want to put a plug, and I think Clive and Chris were getting to this, of sort of multidisciplinary, because the old saying, if all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. If you just have, wastewater engineers, it's going to be an engineered solution. And so when we're bringing like our technical advisory committee, we have hydrologists because we need to look at flows, and we've got water quality experts and marine biologists and climatologists to look at the different impacts. And so I would just encourage that we think as multidisciplinary, and really we need people in all these fields because, we want to avoid the old Mulholland moment. Engineers are going to engineer, and that's not always the full solution.
Hey, Bruce, this is Kim. I just want to reinforce that, particularly since there's such an emphasis these days on nature-based solutions, getting people who really understand biodiversity and the natural ecosystem, I think will be increasingly important. And Clive alluded to that in some of his projects there, but it doesn't matter. Any place we're talking about, nature-based solutions should be taken into consideration.
Yep, that will be actually the topic of our conference coming up in October.
I also just want to say one quick additional comment on this, and this is more of a shout out to the fact that what Bruce said is really correct. It's multidisciplinary, and thankfully more and more people and universities are beginning to understand that, especially in addressing this multifaceted issue of water and the whole nexus integrated way in which this works. And one area that is looking at this specifically, which I know Christian is very well engaged in as well, is of course the concept of peace engineering. This is a new conceptual way to think about what is the role of an engineer in a community. In other words, it's not just, oh, here's a river and I've got to get people across the river, let me just build a bridge. It's how to think about that bridge building project that might also help to say, community on this side of the river and the community on the other side are not in a conflict, and how do I build a bridge that actually promotes coexistence and cooperation, not conflict? So there are interesting programs and thinking from a variety of people and institutions that are beginning to understand to effectively address this water situation, which is so context specific. There's growing and greater appreciation for a multidisciplinary approach.
Absolutely.
So we do actually have one more question that I wanted to get to, Christian, and then I was going to ask you also, Christian, after we answer this question, to talk about that conference that you were referring to in October. So this is a question that kind of returns us back to the contaminants issue. We talked about a number of different types of contaminants, but what about those contaminants that are related to disease transmission? So, really getting like E. coli and other parameters. So Any thoughts about removing such contaminants? Would you say, can we have to do the same thing, or that our standards have to be more stringent, et cetera? And this is an open question. Who wants to tackle it?
It goes to the heart of a whole lot of problems that we have in public health in the infrastructure of around water. The schistosomiasis outbreaks related to when you start organizing water distribution and getting it into areas where these kind of situations have been dormant for a long time. You all of a sudden you can have these kind of things. We had an outbreak of cholera in a little village near in Dominican Republic. Just because we were organizing water systems and people start becoming using the wastewater, trying to organize the wastewater systems without consulting properly, etc. And you've got people interfusing the wastewater and the drinking water together. Bad situations that created the cholera outbreak, and 8 people dead. The whole notion here is that indeed we need to pay a lot of attention to the health components that go with it. As one of the monitoring elements that should be in place is if there is such a thing as a salmonella outbreak, is it food related? Did it come from the irrigation with wastewater, etc.? All kind of interesting questions that I think will demand and monitoring beyond the distribution of the water. And that goes to the situation in public health. On the other hand, if the people have a bit more food and eat better and they have no stunting and the children grow taller, etc., the public health opportunities of improving health are also very much related to how to use wastewater effectively. So
we have 2 minutes left, and I want to make sure to respect everybody's time, the audience, your time. I would love, for each of you, Bruce, Kim, Clive, can you please, kind of close out here? What's next? What are we doing next? And then Christian, I would love for you in the chat, if you could put some information about that conference in October.
It's still in the draft stage. I can't.
Okay. I think the audience might want to know which conference it is and where.
I will bring it up.
Thank you.
Faith, I would just encourage, water reuse means we need to look at water differently than we have in the past here in the US. And everyone needs to think about it differently to get over some of our preconceptions. And we need to value water more here in the US, right? We know it's undervalued. So it really is a lifeline to a more sustainable future. And if we can get everybody to look at it differently and get involved in projects wherever you are in the country or the world, and try to get those projects moving as quickly as possible, because that mental image of all that water going in the ocean is something we've got to address and stop. We can't afford to have that happen. So that's the next step. Get engaged locally.
Great. And locally. Bruce.
Yeah, I think that was sort of a great closing statement. I mean, for us, like I said, we have this technical advisory committee. We're working with UCLA Lipchin Center on that in a couple of weeks. We're going to be coming out with a report of recommendation. It's just going to be a huge push. I mean, the public in LA is actually mostly behind wastewater recycling, more water security locally. There's also going to be more information coming up about how much our wastewater discharges are impacting ocean health and dead zones throughout the California Bight, the Southern California Bight. It's really the price tag and getting the resources and not really impacting affordability. And it's just going to be a really, really big push over the next couple of years to kind of get these projects moving, get the resources needed.
Thanks, Bruce. Clive, 30 seconds.
Thanks. I just want to reemphasize a point that I said earlier. 70% of the world's wastewater is not treated. Right? So that's, just keep that number in mind. 70% of the world's wastewater is not treated, and we're dealing with a global water crisis, which is only being exacerbated by climate change. 70% of the wastewater is not being treated, and most of that 70% is in the developing world, where access to infrastructure, financing, and governance is lacking. So we need to find the best means to attack that, to improve it. And it's massively challenging, and it can only be done at a localized level, because what works in one place is not going to work in another place. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive. And Christian, 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay, let's make sure that we understand wastewater and stormwater together, and that it's both of them need to be handled in ways that makes our human life better and can be worked with. The other thing that I would like to say, that this is the discussion that many other people are also having. This is a global discussion happening all the time. We ourselves at the Global Water Alliance will have in October our 17th annual conference, and we specifically want to tackle nature-based solutions as a form to look at wash, sanitation, and hygiene. And wastewater is indeed a major element in that wash situation. And what can we do with it? Clive's ideas and suggestions are going to be followed up with other groups that working in the Sahel on how to do that in the agricultural setting with water conservation. And so the notion to bring this particular discussion again at the table, we'll be doing it in Philadelphia, to bringing also a little bit of the urban culture with it, about how we are trying to keep Philadelphia green and making it more green. So that the water dynamics are playing out in all kinds of ways. And I think that this particular discussion is going to be helpful in setting the tone for what we're going to say in October. And we're bringing this to the UN. The idea is to bring this to the UN in 2025.
Yes, thank you, Christian. In fact, thank you so much to all of you. This is STEAM panel. It is so wonderful to work with you at the UN Water Conference in 23, and then here again. And I'm looking forward to seeing what comes next for us, as Christian was mentioning. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. Remember to be on the lookout for the recording in a week or so on the IOW YouTube channel. But if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to us directly about the Internet of Water, about this topic, and about geospatial mapping in general. And remember, these webinars are a platform to share your work and expertise across the Internet of Water community and beyond. So if you or your organization have a webinar idea, would like to present on your work, please let us know by emailing our team. And that is internetofwater@lincolninst.edu. So many thanks to all of you.